So on page 183, the grammar discussion for today that we're going to look at is actually review. So this is something that you should have been exposed to already. So it should be at least somewhat familiar. We're talking about verbs and how they're conjugated. There's three different types of verbs. Can you guys tell me what the three categories of verbs are? Yes, AR, ER, and IR. Correct. So we have a regular example, an example of regular ER, IR, and AR verbs below on 183. Cantar, which means to sing, comer, which means to eat, and vivir, which means to live. So that's an AR verb, cantar, an ER, comer, and an IR, vivir. And then the endings, you should know very familiarly. So o, as, a, amos, ais, an, and then the ER is the same thing. You just replace all the A's with an E. O, es, e, emos, eis, en. And then the IR is just like the ER as long as you're talking about inside the boot, and outside the boot is what you would expect an IR verb to be. So o, es, e, inside the boot it's just like the ER. And then outside the boot, the top top right two items, vivimos, vivis, and then in the boot again, viven. So that's the regular endings for present tense, AR, ER, and IR verbs. Again, regular, present tense, and then indicative, which means you're just saying, you're indicating the truth. You're not questioning or commanding. Okay, so turn the page, please, page 184. And here it starts to show some more examples of irregular verbs. So what I'd like you to do is in your notebook or something like that, take each of these verbs, hacer, poner, salir, and traer, and where they have them in a line, I'd like you to put them in the chart format, in the right spots. Okay, so as an exercise, instead of listing them in a line with commas, put them in a chart just like the verbs on the previous page. Canto, cantas, canta. So put them in the right chart, and then we'll go through and we'll it shouldn't be too hard, but take a moment and write those four verbs out in the chart format instead of the sentence lines like they have it as a list. You can write it in your notebook. So what I want you to notice is that these verbs, three of them are ER, one of them is IR, and there's no AR. So the endings should all be just like the ER and the IR endings for the comer and vivir verb on page 183. Except that first one. That first one, which is first person singular, that conjugation should be in the top left of your chart, okay, because that's where first person singular should be. And instead of it being irregular, take the root, take the suffix, and replace the suffix with an O. So it would be the root plus an O. They change something by adding a G or changing a letter to a G, but it adds this G letter every time. So where hacer for the others is correct, haces, hace, it's just the root plus an E ending, ER verb ending. The root changes, but only for the first person singular. So we've looked at other verbs where the root changes inside the boot, but this one is it's irregular because it only changes first person singular. So hacer changes to hago, poner changes to pongo. So those are a little different, right? Hacer changes the C to a G, where poner doesn't change the N, it just adds a G. So it's a little different. Same thing with salir. Salir means to leave or to go out, and it adds a G. And then traer is even more different because it adds an IG. So they're all four very irregular, and they only change for the first person singular. Every other conjugation follows the same rules of take the root and replace the suffix with the verb ending, and you just leave the root at what it is. Everything else should be the same, except that first person singular. So these are irregular in the yo form. Next, we have a list of verbs that are irregular, but not just in the yo form. They're irregular in many ways. Irregular verbs can be classified in many ways. Often these verbs depart from the regular verb conjugation in more than one way. Study the list of verbs below, which verbs follow similar patterns. So go ahead and take a look at that list of verbs below, the second list of irregular verbs, and look at the conjugations, and somebody tell me, which of those verbs follow similar patterns as each other? What are some of the verbs that follow similar patterns as each other? I know it's Monday. Somebody tell me, looking at the conjugations, what are two different verbs that conjugate similarly? Which one? Dar and ir. Yes. Doy, voy, das, vas, da, va, damos, vamos, dais, vais, and dan, van. Good. That's a great example. Notice that normally, if you look at let's see, those are AR and IR verbs. So some really odd things about it. AR and IR you would expect to have different endings. And yet these are two verbs, AR and IR verbs, and yet their endings are identical. The only difference is that root letter, D or V. Also, there's no accent marks in either one. There's no accent marks, where normally that second person plural, the middle right square in the chart, normally it has an accent mark, but there's not an accent mark on these. And then the first person singular, the yo form, I form of the verb, they both end in Y instead of O. Like hablo, it's ends in a Y, doy and voy. Good. What else? What are some other verbs that follow similar patterns? Venir and tener. Good. And then again, you'll notice that they're different verbs, like categories. It's an ER and an IR verb, and yet they also still follow a very similar pattern. Ben, what are some of the things that make them similar? Those two verbs. Why would you say that verb? Sorry? All the endings? Not quite. Some of them are different. Which ones are different? Which conjugations for tener and venir are not the same? Those endings are the same. The only difference in those two are the first letter. The endings for first person plural are different though. So tener is an ER verb and venir is an IR verb. And so these verbs do follow the regular pattern for ER and IR verbs, right? First person plural, the nosotros form for ER should be tenemos, and it is. And then for IR verbs, it does not follow the ER pattern. So it's venimos instead of venemos. And then the second person plural, tenéis and venís, follow the pattern too. So these endings for tener and venir, the endings follow exactly the pattern that they should for ER and IR verbs. So what makes these two similar? The endings are similar, but why? What makes them irregular and similar to each other? You could write it out in a chart. Write these verbs in a chart. So let's do that. So your notes, and then write it out. Tengo, tienes, tiene in the left side, and tenemos, tenéis, and tienen on the right side. So tener, you'll notice is irregular in the yo form, just like those verbs above, because it adds a G. Like poner is pongo, tener is tengo. So those are similar to each other. But the rest of the conjugations, tengo, tienes, tiene, tenemos, tenéis, tienen, all of the words in bold, where do they fall on the chart? Where are they located on the chart? If you write out the conjugations from the verb tener in a chart, all the words that they list here in bold, where are they located on the chart? In what? In the boot, right. So tener and venir are both root boot changing verbs because they add the I in the boot. And that's also why they are irregular. Okay? So it's just noticing patterns like that. Even though they're irregular, they're going to be similar to each other. So irregular doesn't mean arbitrary. Arbitrary means it could just change in whatever way it wants. But actually, the irregular verbs very often will follow similar patterns. So that it's irregular, but it's kind of like a large group of irregular verbs because they create their new norm for each other, right? There's kind of a sense of they're all similar, but they're just a smaller group of verbs that are different from the large irregular groups. So they are irregular, but they're not arbitrary. They still follow patterns. And looking for those patterns is going to help you do a couple things. One, memorize. It'll help you memorize it when you need to memorize how a conjugation works. But it also helps you to guess. if you come across a new verb, like let's say you came across, let's say you knew the verb tener, which means to have, and you came across venir, you might eventually be able to get to the point where you can guess certain things. Or as soon as someone says, actually, it's not venes, it's vienes. And if you were to say, oh, so it's vengo vienes, you would likely know that third person singular is not vene. You would just automatically know it's vienes because you've familiarized yourself with these patterns. So that's part of becoming fluent, is just becoming natural and familiar with using the patterns the way that they flow. So you should look for those patterns when you're looking at memorization, at vocab and grammar, to help you remember them and to speak better. Any questions? All right. So your homework is activity, let me make sure I get this right, 2 and then 3A. So when it says a letter with a number, I'm talking about an activity where it's broken up into different parts. In the book, they have it as paso uno and paso dos. So when I say A, I mean paso uno, right? The first part. So 3A, you don't need to do paso dos. So do activity 2, activity 3A, and activity 7, which is right after those verbs. Okay? Any questions? All right. When you're done with that, you may use the rest of the time as a study hall or as a nap time if you'd like, because it's Monday. So, and it's not just any Monday, it's after spring break Monday, which means I know you're all tired, not rested. Spring break isn't restful. Spring break is exciting.